Get started shortly. Good morning and good evening, wherever you are, and thank you very much for joining us. I can't seem to request control of the slides. If you can just do the flipping, then I'll just get started. Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. So today's webinar will focus on what is Verra's plastic program and plastic credits, and how this mechanism can be a valuable tool for policymakers to meet their plastic waste management priorities. In particular, we'll discuss how this innovative mechanism can mobilize finance from a variety of sources, which is essential to enable a circular, equitable, and just transition around the world. First, let me briefly introduce us. I'm Vijay Yu. I'm a Senior Program Officer at Verra, and co-hosting with me today is Komal Sinha. She's the Director of our Plastic Policy and Market Program at Verra. For the next 45 minutes, we'll introduce our plastic program, how it mobilizes finance, and how it can be integrated into national and global actions. We'll also provide some examples and specific next steps for action. Please use the Q&A function if you have any questions for us. Now let's get started. So what is Verra? Verra is the world's leading standard setter for climate action and sustainable development. We're a nonprofit organization founded in 2007, and our headquarters is in Washington, D.C. We have staff all over the world. Verra develops and manages a range of standards which are used widely by the private sector, governments, and civil society to meet their climate and development goals. We currently have more than 3,000 projects in 95 countries. For example, the Verified Carbon Standard is the world's leading voluntary carbon market program and has issued more than 1 billion carbon credits. The Plastic Waste Reduction Standard is our newest program and the topic of today's webinar. Before diving in our plastic program, I wanted to just take a step back and reflect on the status quo of the ubiquitous plastic pollution problem, which is why Verra developed the plastic program in the first place. Plastic pollution is a well-known environmental problem. The plastic economy is largely not circular, and 14 million tons of plastics are leaking into the ocean each year, and this number is still growing. Plastic waste is also a human problem, as there are 20 million informal waste workers around the world, and they are exposed to unsafe labor conditions and health risks without being paid dignified compensation. Plastic pollution is also an equity problem, as vulnerable communities are being disproportionately affected due to the lack of infrastructure and the transboundary movement of plastic waste. On the global level, there is a $40 billion US dollar funding gap by 2040 for plastic waste management. And the challenge is especially stark in the global south, as nearly 90% of plastic circularity investment since 2018 went to North America and Europe. In face of such complex challenges, we need all the tools in the box. All the existing government and industry commitments only lead to a 7% reduction in plastic leakage compared to the business as usual scenario. It is not the technology that's hindering the progress. We have all the necessary solutions, but what we don't have right now is adequate regulatory framework, business models, and financial mechanisms. If we were able to pull both voluntary and regulatory levers with adequate financial resources, it would be possible to achieve an 80% reduction in plastic ocean leakage by 2040. And our program aims to facilitate precisely that, as it is an investment mechanism to catalyze effective plastic waste management globally, particularly for those regions that need this finance most urgently. So what is plastic standard and plastic credit? They are the two critical components of our program. The plastic standard and the supporting methodology provide the underlying framework of our program. It is a basis for measuring and monitoring plastic waste management projects' impact, and to check if the operation of a project is in alignment with the mandatory environmental and social safeguards. project compliant with plastic standards and are audited by third party can issue plastic credits. And plastic credits can be purchased by organizations to meet their voluntary and regulatory commitments. The revenue can be used then to establish or upscale plastic waste recycling or collection activities. I do also want to emphasize here that Verra is a standard setter, so we don't develop these projects or sell credits. What we do is to provide the framework and the supporting methodologies that allow projects to use our program responsibly. We also manage the plastic credits on our registry in a very transparent manner. 1 plastic credit signifies that 1 ton of additional plastic waste is collected from nature or is recycled. It is essentially an investment mechanism that supports waste management infrastructures, enables social safeguards and better livelihood for waste workers. It also works as a complementary measure to upstream solutions. And both upstream and downstream solutions are needed to address plastic pollution across the entire life cycle. There are 2 types of plastic credits, the waste collection credits and waste recycling credits. Collection credits aim to support activities that collect plastic waste and make sure they don't leak back into nature. This is particularly relevant for those materials that are currently very difficult to recycle or do not get recycled at all. And in general, there is a lack of incentive for their collection and safe management. Plastic recycling credits, on the other hand, aim to help scale recycling facilities and generate recycled feedstock that can go back to the economy for a second life and replace virgin plastic usage. This graph shows the whole process of how our plastic program works in real life. So let's start from the yellow section on top. There are these individual projects around the world that are doing plastic collection and recycling on the ground. Let's assume that they are meeting all of our requirements. Then the third-party audits will be needed for the projects to prove their compliance. They will also go through a public comment period so concerns can be raised from the public. And once all that is done, Verra, as a standard setter, will review the projects, and if everything checks out, the project will be able to issue plastic credit. These credits will be displayed on our registry, which allows anyone from the public to see, for example, where is the project located, what type of activities are being carried out, and what type of plastics are being recycled or collected. Once credit has been issued, businesses and other organizations can purchase them to fulfill their plastic stewardship targets. Our team has conducted a webinar last month, which provided more in-depth information on this aspect. The recordings are also available on our website. And now back to this process. Ultimately, funding received through plastic credits can go back to these projects on the ground and help them to keep doing the good work. So how does the standard help us to certify the most impactful projects? Here I want to highlight a few critical components. Our standard has global applicability, and projects from anywhere in the world can issue it and issue plastic credit if they comply with our standard. An essential element for credit scheme is additionality, which means projects need to demonstrate that their project activity has impact above a baseline scenario. The standard also has robust development and governance process. The program was developed through a multi-stakeholder approach, has undergone public consultation and technical reviews. It also undergoes periodic updates that's informed by policy, markets, and technological developments. The standard also enables third-party verification to ensure integrity. Our projects have to be third-party verified to ensure that they provided sufficient evidence to show that they meet our requirements. Lastly, the standard has incorporated social safeguards that require project proponents to confirm that there is no negative impacts on the natural environment, local community, or the informal waste workers as a result of the project activity. And this is the current scope of our program. Our program currently includes all 7 types of plastic, plus composite materials that contain plastic. And it really can encompass a range of different activities. It could be recovery of ocean-bound plastics, municipal or private waste collection, infrastructure development, collections through waste pickers, and the expansion or establishments of mechanical and chemical recycling facilities. Now I'll pass over to my co-host Como, and she will take you on a deep dive of how our program works as an innovative funding mechanism.
So hello, everyone, and thank you, Vigil, very much for providing a very helpful context on why we need a combination of voluntary and regulatory levers to significantly reduce plastic in the environment. Now, Vigil also mentioned that in order to address the plastic problem and the underlying social issue, we need one core ingredient, and that is finance. And that's what we will take you through in the next part of this presentation. So there is a growing trend currently where we are seeing regional and global policies being developed and implemented that can curb plastic pollution. But at the same time, we also understand that implementation of these policies hinges on the availability of adequate and sustainable finance. And that's where Verra's plastic program comes in as a proven mechanism that can mobilize finance from a variety of sources to address legacy plastic pollution and to control further leakage by development and scaling up of plastic waste collection and recycling systems anywhere in the world. Our program also becomes particularly relevant in the context of those countries that are vulnerable to the impacts of plastic pollution, are disproportionately affected by it, but currently do not have adequate resources to address this problem themselves. Now, when we say that Verra mobilizes finance from Verra's plastic program mobilizes finance from a variety of sources, what do we really mean? And that's what we would try to kind of decode for you in the next few minutes. On the left-hand side of your screen, you will see examples of a few sources of finance, meaning that finance can be made available from some of these potential sources to support a range of plastic waste management activities. And some of these examples are finance coming from the private sector, public and the government sector, as well as development banks and financial institutions. On the center of your screen, you see a few examples of potential implementation approaches. And on the right-hand side, you see examples of a few plastic waste collection and recycling activities. Now, there is a common link between these three, and that's Verra's plastic program. So Verra's plastic program can be embedded in each of these implementation approaches in a way that it can ensure availability of large-scale investment from these sources of finance towards high-quality projects that are able to scale the impacts of plastic waste collection and recycling activities anywhere in the world. Now, in the next few slides, I will try to explain how Verra's plastic credits can integrate with each of these potential implementation approaches and what is the underlying benefit that it can deliver. Starting with outcome-based bonds. I'm sure most, if not all of you, would have seen the news in the last few weeks related to World Bank's issuance of outcome-based bonds, but just for everybody's benefits, I'll try to summarize it once more. World Bank has issued a series of outcome-based bonds that provides its investors an opportunity to support specific development-based projects and outcomes. These bonds harness private capital, transferring the project performance risk to its investors, who are then rewarded when these underlying activities are successful. The latest in the series of their bonds is a plastic waste reduction-linked bond, which is a $100 million principal protected bond for a duration of 7 years. Now, why is it relevant for us today? Is because the investors in this bond will receive financial returns linked to plastic credits, and these plastic credits are expected to be generated through 2 projects that are currently in the process of registering with Verra's plastic program. This is a very important development that directly speaks to credibility of Verra's plastic program and its requirements, that provides confidence to a broad range of investors to support plastic waste management projects in their priority geographies. Now, multilateral funds. We know that multilateral funding arrangements are being explored within the realm of the international legally binding instrument or the global plastic treaty negotiations as a potential source of fund for supporting the vulnerable and underserved geographies to help them meet the obligations of the plastic treaty. And just on a side note, from now on, I will refer to the Global Plastic Treaty or the International Legally Binding Instrument as ILBI, because otherwise it's really just a mouthful. So just going back to the multilateral funds, these funds typically prioritize investments in a way that they mobilize funds from non-developing country parties, and they deploy it to those regions that have the largest capacity and financial gaps, such as least developed countries, island nations, vulnerable regions, and so on. Now, by integrating Verra's plastic program requirement into the multilateral fund would ensure that they can use an existing framework that can simplify the due diligence criteria for the fund's project selection, and at the same time ensure that their investments are directed to projects that are additional, verified, and go to projects that are in the most urgent need of this finance. Another funding arrangement or implementation approach that is being explored as a part of the ILBI discussions is a global plastic pollution fee model. Now, in summary, the proposal is that the plastic polymer producers will be required to pay a fee for the plastic that they produce, and this fee can then be invested in a range of upstream and downstream interventions, including plastic waste management activities. Just like I indicated earlier, with this fee model as well, Verra's plastic program can integrate in a way that the proceeds can then be directed to high-quality projects that adhere to requirements of additionality, are third-party audited, and adhere to environmental and social safeguards. Here again, Verra's plastic standard could be leveraged as an existing framework to measure the impact of these investments. Voluntary contributions. Before I talk about that, just a little bit of context. So we know that investment needs for waste management just across the non-East OECD countries combined until 2040 would be close to $1 trillion. We know that policies and regulations, while critical, take time for development and enforcement. And during this time, we need to continue to take action to be able to control the ongoing plastic leakage. And this is where voluntary contributions have always been and will continue to play an important part. Verra's plastic program can unlock voluntary capital from a range of financial sources, just as we have seen, in order to support and strengthen waste management systems in a range of geographies. Not only now when these policies are being formulated, but also in the future to complement these policies. Now, so we've talked about now in summary about a range of sources of finance from which Verra's plastic program can mobilize finance using a range of innovative implementation approaches to support downstream plastic waste management projects. In this section, what we will talk about is how Verra's plastic program links to global and national plastic policy landscape. Verra's plastic program is central to regulatory and voluntary action. It can support the financing objectives of the ILBI. It can integrate with regional plastic waste management plans and priorities. And as we have seen earlier, complementary to all of these national and global approaches, it can continue to drive voluntary finance to a range of plastic waste management activities from a variety of financial sources. So moving on to the International Legally Binding Instrument on Plastic Pollution, or ILBI, as we refer to it. I know most of you, again, are very familiar with these developments, the negotiations that are going on as we speak and expected to be finalized by end of 2024 to develop this legally binding instrument. So I'm going to spare all of you the details of it, but there are just 2 points that I want to underscore here. One is that the instrument is expected to include a combination of both binding and voluntary approaches to address plastic pollution across the life cycle of plastic. And the second is the zero draft, as you would have already seen, has come up on the UNEP website, which will form the basis of textual negotiations, presents possible core obligations along with control measures and voluntary approaches for the implementation of this instrument. And here again, we find it important to mention that Verra's plastic program and plastic credits can be leveraged as a voluntary and regulatory tool that can support in meeting several of these proposed core obligations of the ILBI. Now, in this slide, what we have done is that we have basically pulled out some of those relevant core obligations as they appear in the zero draft of the treaty text. And in the following slides, we will talk about how Verra's plastic credit can enable in meeting these core obligations. Now, one of the possible core obligations is for regions to incorporate minimum post-consumer recycled plastic content in plastic and plastic products within the territories. This is an important obligation to ensure, to reduce dependence on virgin plastic production and use. And Verra's plastic credits are very well positioned to support in this core obligation because they can drive finance to those projects that can set up and scale recycling infrastructure. Improved recycling infrastructure will essentially directly translate into availability of improved recycled feedstock needed to meet these targets. And I think it is important to scale up these recycling systems because we know that the current supply of recycled feedstock is nearly not enough to meet the growing demands. Another possible core obligation that we have seen is for regions to ensure safe and environmentally sound management of plastic waste through collection, sorting, recycling, and safe disposal, as well as addressing legacy plastic pollution, taking into account special circumstances of lesser developed countries and island nations. Again, as before, Verra's plastic credits can mobilize public and private sector investment to establish and scale waste management systems, particularly in vulnerable geographies. Furthermore, Verra's plastic credits are underpinned by the requirements of Verra's plastic standard that ensures that plastic waste that is collected is safe, environmentally sound, promotes circularity, and prevents its leakage back into the environment. Just transition. I'm sure this is, again, a term that is familiar to most of us participating in this session today. So the background is essentially that the treaty itself is called for, the ILBI text is called for a fair and equitable transition for the affected population, including waste picker, women, and children. Now, I don't think I need to hone in on the fact that plastic is not just an environmental issue, but has far-reaching consequences for the vulnerable communities, particularly the informal sector, that form the backbone of the collection economy, particularly in the global south, but live under extremely hazardous and unsafe conditions, and so far have been excluded from policy discourse. The ILBI has recognized this gap and therefore has called for this to be included as one of the possible core obligations. What I think is important to mention is Verra's plastic program has recognized the need for a just transition from the very beginning, and therefore, there are several mandatory requirements that are inbuilt into the program to kind of facilitate a just transition. These include, so first is ensuring that the vulnerable communities, including informal waste workers, are identified through locally appropriate methods for the development of a project, and these communities are involved in the project's design and implementation process. There are mandatory social safeguards in place to support fair and equitable compensation and preventative health and safety practices for all workers involved in the project. And finally, all projects need to undergo third-party audits to make sure that the project is operating in compliance with each of these requirements. And then extended producer responsibility schemes. So again, regions have been called upon to consider either development of EPR schemes within their regions or develop schemes that are similar in purpose to an EPR mechanism that are locally appropriate and fit the national circumstances. Again, Verra's plastic credits can support EPR schemes at various stages of maturity. The plastic credits are backed by a range of plastic program requirements that can enhance the effectiveness and impact of EPR schemes. Some of these requirements that could be relevant for national governments as they consider development of EPR schemes would include standardized monitoring and verification protocols, third-party audits, and social and environmental safeguards to make sure that the vulnerable communities and the informal communities are included during development of these national plans. So we've talked about the core obligations, but at the same time, Verra's plastic program can also support with implementation of the ILBI, particularly when it comes to monitoring and measuring the impacts of plastic waste collection and recycling activities. For governments in particular, Verra's plastic program could be relevant for, one is national reporting, both under the current priorities as well as proposed national plans, as well as measuring and reporting the impact of EPR schemes. And we think that the use of a standardized uniform framework is imperative to make sure that we create a level playing field, and then the progress between projects and regions can be compared as and when necessary. Verra's plastic program enables this because it's a proven, established framework that is used by projects across the world and can be adapted for use for national governments. So then we have talked about, a lot about plastic credits and how they interact with the Global Plastic Treaty. But I think then the interesting question is that how can we operationalize all of this information in the context of the instrument itself? So just to reiterate, we've discussed that effective implementation of the ILBI is directly dependent on the availability of adequate finance. And therefore, as policymakers and national governments, you might want to consider recognizing plastic credits as a finance mechanism within the text of ILBI. What this will do is this will create or unlock large-scale investments that can then be used to support various core obligations of the instrument that we just talked about a little while earlier. This can also cascade into national plans. So national governments can consider including plastic credits as a finance mechanism within their national plans with the aim of achieving the proposed nationally determined targets that might be rolled out resulting from the ILBI. And we touched upon the need for applying a uniform framework across countries. And this is where including a reference to Verra's plastic program within the text of ILBI could ensure that we are creating a framework, a standardized framework for measuring the impact of plastic waste collection and recycling activities. Just to sum it up, we just talked about everything related to how plastic credits can operate in the context of the legally binding instrument, but that's really just one part of the picture. We know that at the same time, national governments are also implementing measures in order to support the national plastic waste management priorities. One of the most talked about implementation approach is EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility Schemes, which is a producer-focused mechanism, as you all are already aware, that basically places the responsibility for plastic waste collection, recycling, and safe disposal on the waste producers. Now, this graph here illustrates the status of EPR across the world, and as you will note, that there are only about 45 mandatory EPR regulations that exist in the world today, and most of these are concentrated in the global north. Of course, there are some that are starting to come up in other parts of the world as well, but I think it's not lost on us, the complexity and the challenges associated with developing and enforcing such a complex system, particularly in developing countries. Now, then the question again arises is, how can Verra's plastic program and plastic credits support with effective implementation of EPR schemes? So in order to answer that question, we present to you two scenarios. Scenario one is for those regions that do not have an EPR currently or have EPR in very early stages of development. In these instances, governments may want to consider including plastic credits in their plastic waste management plans or the developing EPR notifications, which can create an early impetus for private sector finance to flow into your region for strengthening local waste management systems. Governments may also want to consider hand-holding local waste management organizations to set up for their certification with Verra's plastic program. You might want to consider providing them with an enabling environment that can help them address some of the initial hurdles associated with kickstarting a project. Providing them with, initial capital expenditure to kickstart these projects, or providing them with easy access to land, for setting up collection or recycling facilities are just some very high-level examples that come to mind, but I'm sure there are very many options available in which governments can support local waste management organizations through public-private partnerships or other models. Once these projects are set up and are certified with Verra's plastic program, they become attractive to a range of local and global investors, and it becomes really kind of conducive to receive finance from multiple sources to kind of meet your regional plastic waste management priorities. And finally, governments may also consider encouraging companies to use plastic credits in lieu of paying the EPR fee. And this can reduce the government's administrative burden and at the same time ensure that the finance is directly going to high quality projects on the ground and helping them able to scale their impact. And the second scenario is for those regions that have already integrated plastic credits within their EPR text. We do recognize that this is a very, very new and upcoming area, but we have seen certain instances where credits have been integrated within the EPR regulations, notably India and Philippines. And we do think that there might be other regions who might be interested in kind of replicating this approach. And for these regions, what we propose is governments might want to consider including criteria for generation and use of high quality plastic credits certified to Verra's plastic program within their EPR. What this will do is this will ensure that there are high quality plastic waste collection and recycling projects that are developed in your region, that adhere to environmental and social safeguards, that give confidence to a range of investors to support these projects. And finally, through all of this, we don't want to forget that Verra's plastic program can still be used as an existing framework to measure the impact of plastic waste collection and recycling activities and to support an effective implementation of EPR schemes. Now, with that, I would like to pass on the baton to Vijil again, who will talk about a few examples of Verra's plastic program projects. I did allude to public-private partnership models in which governments can think about supporting local waste management organizations. And we have a live example of that Vijil can talk through and also provide with closing remarks. So thank you very much. And over to you, Vijil.
Thank you, Komal. Now I will give you a few examples of our existing projects. First of all, I would like to show you this graph, which, next slide, please. Go. Thanks. So since the program's launch in 2021, we've seen over 50 projects listed, meaning that they have initiated the registration process and intend to issue plastic credits. As you can see, these projects are really well spread out around the world in the global north and global south, demonstrating that the plastic credits can be used by a variety of different activities in different geographies. Of these projects listed, 7 have completed the registration process, and which means they are eligible to start issuing plastic credits. And we have many more projects in the final stage of review, so we are expecting to see this number grow in the coming months. And here is a project that Komal has alluded to, Project Stop. It's a very excellent example of public-private partnership in Indonesia. So it might be a special relevance for policymakers who want to explore how they can support and scale the impacts of waste management and activities in their region. The project proponents of Project Stop partner directly with the national, regional, and local governments to design and help implement low-cost waste management systems that are most suitable for the local condition. The initiative also works alongside existing local activities and stakeholders. And another existing project I wanted to show you is the Dikali project. It is based in Senegal, which is the least developed country. And this project expands local capacity and infrastructures for plastic recycling and collection. So plastic waste is collected from nature and are recycled into new feedstock by this project, So this one actually qualifies for both collection and recycling credits. Additionally, this project has created a household-level plastic waste separation system. So it's also a great example of how plastic credit finance can be used to improve collection and recycling systems in regions that need it the most. Here I'll run through a couple steps that you could take, and here are some immediate actions that we encourage you to take. And starting from just to learn more about our program, you could find everything we mentioned, the standards, the methodologies, existing projects on our website. And you can also just reach out to us for more information. Here we have our email on the bottom. And if you're a policymaker and you're interested to engage in supporting project development, please also reach out to us. We can explore how we can help providing these opportunities for these projects. As Como mentioned, government endorsement and involvement in the projects can really reduce entry barrier, and they also provide confidence to local and international organizations to invest in your region. We can also explore, for example, public-private partnership structure, as I've briefly touched upon for Project Stop. And finally, if you're attending INC 4 or 5, we'll be happy to meet you in person and discuss in greater detail, especially on how high-quality plastic credits are critical to unlocking innovative finance from international and regional sources. Generally speaking, Verra can provide professional advice towards these objectives, including technical and capacity building workshops and seminars. So with that, I hope you have your questions answered in the Q&A. And if not, please, again, just write to us and we will definitely get back to you. And thank you again for joining us today. And we look forward to hearing from you or meeting you in person soon. Thank you very much.